Thanks for tuning in. You're listening to Agriculture Today. Our interest this segment in sorghum and soybeans and the potential for seedling diseases on those respective crops at planting time. We brought by a research plant pathologist here at K-State, Chris Little, whose research program delves into these seedling diseases and what we can do as producers to counteract them. And collectively, Chris, these are to be contended with, these diseases. They can cause headaches.
That's right. And so when we look at both soybean and sorghum, we see some similar pathogens and we see sort of similar conditions that can promote these diseases. And in fact, the pathogens, and they're mainly fungal pathogens, are really the same. Pythium, Fusarium, and Rhizoctonia, the big three that are our three pathogens of seedlings. And we're going to find both of those groups of pathogens on both of our crops. Now, we're planting a little bit earlier in soybean, so we have a little bit of cooler temperature, a little bit more moisture, and so we might expect to see Pythium more frequently, for example. But we find a lot of Fusarium there as well. The sorghum goes in a little bit later. It's a little bit drier, a little bit warmer, so maybe more Fusarium, more Rhizoctonia, but still a little bit of Pythium if it gets wet. So that just kind of tells me a little bit about, favorable conditions. So anytime that we have a heavier soil, higher clay content, higher silt content, doesn't drain quite as well as a sandier soil, and also whenever we have cooler temperatures below 65 degrees or so, then we're going to have a higher chance of seeing a seedling disease issue. And if you go out to the field and have a look at your planting, hopefully your stand establishment is good, your seedling emergence is good. Sometimes these seeds can germinate underground and they don't make it out of the soil, and that's pre-emergent damping off. And sometimes they make it out of the soil and then they sort of tip over on you, and that's post-emergent damping off. Fortunately, there's a lot of seed treatment products that are recommended by our seeds persons and extension out there that can really help deal with that problem. So we really encourage people to seek the advice of their county extension or seeds persons to get the right kind of seed treatments on there. But I think what's really important is, and both in soybean and sorghum, high-quality intact seed that's pathogen-free. So seeds are really full of fungi. They're full of pathogens already there. And then when you put them into a soil condition, wet, saturated soil, for example, and you also have pathogens in the soil itself, all those factors can come together to give a problem. Okay, so you want to plant seed that's got really high germination. And unfortunately, the seed that we get for producers is really good quality germination seed. Mm-hmm. That's going to really help because you want to get out of the ground as fast as possible. So rapid emergence is really, really critical to escape some of the pathogens that are in the soil and also sort of outgrow some of those seed-borne pathogens that might already be inside there, which is a fairly typical kind of thing. I also think that correct depth and plant population is really important. If you're a little bit too deep or you're a little bit too high in planting population, that can give you some stress, some competition, especially in sorghum, that might reduce your stand just a little bit.
So there are a number of cultural things that folks can do. There's yet another consideration there, you say. If you're utilizing herbicide early on in that crop, you might want to watch that because there can be additional stress to the young stand from that treatment.
That's correct. And so it turns out that anything that adds a stress like improper herbicide use, whether that's using the wrong herbicide or using the wrong rate of herbicide, can stress or injure seedlings. And whenever seedlings are injured, they become more susceptible to seedling pathogens like our Fusarium and our Pythium and our Rhizoctonia pathogens. Another thing that's sort of been recommended is just an increase in rhizobium application to seeds will help to establish the seedling root actually a little bit better, help outcompete on the root surface some of those pathogens too, and that's been shown to kind of improve emergence and improve establishment in various field trials. So that's kind of an interesting thing that can be done.
But once again, producers need to be mindful of what they're watching out for in terms of the signs and symptoms.
That's right.
And those are typically very vivid, are they not?
Yeah. So if you're having a stand problem, you can see it at 60 miles an hour almost, because you'll see just sort of skips in the row or large open spaces. And it's not atypical to see low areas in the field that have some blank spots and what have you. But I'm not talking about that as much as just seeing continuous scattered open spots in the field, which really can show you that you've got a stand establishment issue that might be due to pathogens and not just low-lying water or something like that. If you go out there and have a look, again, you can see if you've got any seeds that have rotted in the ground. You can see whether or not you've got any damping off, pre- or post-emergent damping off. But even the treated seeds, almost every seedling that I pull in Kansas has some constriction and some lesion activity right at the soil line. So it's very common to see that. And all those pathogens that I mentioned earlier can sort of cause some of that constriction or those brown lesions. And so you can have a look and see if you've got that going on. So as long as your seedlings have emerged and they're growing, a little bit of lesion activity at the base isn't going to be a problem. It's only if you see some damping off or big skips in the row that you might have a problem. And also, looking at the seedling quality. Again, if you look in a space that's been flooded out, maybe on the edges where you have some really stunted yellowish seedlings, just be aware that's an abiotic kind of thing, just too much water standing in a low spot. However, if you've got those skips in a row, especially in parts of the field that drain really well, maybe you've got a disease there. Maybe you've got some seedling pathogens going on. When you have stunted seedlings, chlorotic or yellowing seedlings, or deformed seedlings, those all kind of give you an idea of seedling quality. And often those seedlings are not going to be able to catch up with the healthy plants, and you're going to see a end-of-season yield impact just because, just like stunted animals, they won't catch up with the healthy animals the same way with the soybean plant or the sorghum. So the things I've been saying really apply to both crops in general. Yeah.
So as far as actual farmer cultural practices, things that they can do yet to improve their chances of fending off these seedling diseases, are you uncovering new tactics at all?
Well, our main emphasis has been stress management. So understanding what soil factors actually associate with healthy seedlings and what soil factors associate with sick seedlings. So, for example, in sorghum, what we've found is that planting sorghum in soils with pH of 5.5 or less really promotes seedling disease.
Mm-hmm. Stresses the new crop.
Yeah, so whenever we have a low pH like that, we're going to stress the seedling, and it's going to become more susceptible to the seedling disease. Again, that's why it's good to have high-quality seed and good seed treatment that can overcome an environmental stress like that. Mm. Another thing, again, is the oxygen content in soil. So when oxygen content is low, fusarium, especially Fusarium oxysporum, which is a species that's very common on seedlings, likes that low oxygen content and will actually become more of a pathogen than if you aerate the soil or you have a sandier soil. So soil texture is an area that we're very interested in because often we forget about our soils in this disease triangle, if you will. So the soil conditions are part of that environment side of the disease triangle. And so when we have a low pH soil, when we have a low oxygen content soil, Fusarium oxysporum likes that and will be more of a pathogen on soybean and sorghum.
For the producer, as they think ahead to the planting season, due diligence in prepping for the potential of these seedling diseases, these blights, these fungi that can settle in and really set the crop back from the jump, which then sets it on a path of lower productivity. So.
That's right. And it may be a very subtle yield drag that kind of just happens over the cropping season for that slow start. If producers have some low-lying spaces on their farm where they see a lot of soil saturation, where they see a lot of heavy soils, they may be aware of that. You may need to kind of think about your seed treatments, you may need to think about your planting densities for a spot on their farm that really has a seedling problem every year.
Thank you for coming by and briefing us on all of this and providing some recommendations, Chris, to our soybean and sorghum growers out there.
Thanks for having me.
He's Chris Little. He's a research plant pathologist here at Kansas State. Definitely some things for you growers to think about in defending your young crops as they go into the ground from seedling diseases. And you're listening to Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.
Agriculture and food systems are the main drivers of the Kansas economy, but must be improved in order to feed the world's growing population. How are we going to do so? Reduce food loss, find ways to preserve grasslands, and help families stretch their dollars. Global food systems is one of the 5 grand challenges K-State Research and Extension is addressing. To learn more, visit www.ksre.ksu.edu.
This is Agriculture Today, and time now for another profile of a farm couple who will be honored as Kansas Master Farmer, Master Farm Homemaker in ceremonies later this week here in Manhattan. Again, to remind, this recognition program co-sponsored by K-State Research and Extension and Kansas Farmer Magazine. It can be safely said that Mark Diederich Family Farms doesn't shy away from trying new ideas. Mark and Evelyn Diederich operate a highly successful cow-calf and crops enterprise south of Greenleaf in Washington County. After graduating from Kansas State University in 1984 with a degree in animal sciences, Mark worked for 5 years for a well-known livestock production family near Manhattan. Then he and his new bride, Evelyn, returned to the family farm in 1990. Evelyn then launching her career as a medical technician at local hospitals. They eventually struck out on their own as Mark Diederich Family Farms, which now consists of 2,800 acres, half crops, half pasture, 400 cows, and 500 stocker and finishing calves. They have become well recognized for their innovative ideas in cow herd management. Mark talks about the beginnings of his production agriculture career.
I grew up right here on this farm. And so then I went to school at Kansas State. And while I was going to school at K-State, I worked for Don and Jane Good, and then Craig and Amy Good. And then when I graduated from Kansas State, we worked for them for about 5 years, 89, and then in 90, we moved back here to the family farm.
You partnered with your father at that point, is that correct?
Yes.
And as you were growing up, what was the nature of the farm? Was it diversified, crops and cattle?
So we didn't raise corn or soybeans much. It was mainly wheat and milo. And then we had a fall calving herd that was here. And we milked cows just for our own use till I was like in 8th grade, hand milked cows. So then they were gone. I wasn't sorry to see that chore leave.
Evelyn, you were brought up in northwest Kansas, correct?
Yes, I grew up in Colby. We lived in the country, but my dad managed a feedlot. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't exactly farming, but still country living.
So how did you come to meet this gentleman then?
I was in school at K-State. I went to 2 years of junior college there at Colby and then transferred to K-State. And I was in school, and he was finished actually, but we met and began dating. And then I went on to Kansas City to the KU Medical Center for my training in laboratory science, and I finished up in 1988 and then worked there in Kansas City for a year and then came back to Manhattan and worked in Manhattan.
So important to point out, you weren't pursuing a career in agriculture directly.
No, but I was always interested in it. I grew up with 4-H and country living, and so I knew that that's what I wanted eventually.
And we want to note that you have applied that education to a long career now in the health field.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I work at the Washington County Hospital in the lab. I'm blessed to be able to work part-time, and that really fits my family well, and I can still help on the farm. I do all the record keeping and office work. And
all the running, parts,
running,
moving tractors,
and
people.
that allows me time to still do all that, but yet keep in touch with my career.
And if we squeeze her to do it, she can run a combine and a grain cart and a truck, but she just as soon somebody else do it. But
I would just as soon. I'm glad Ryan's back.
If nobody's there to pick it up, she's like, okay. So
that's true. There's a lot of truth.
She's very adaptable. She can do a lot of jobs.
So talk about once you returned to the operation for good in Washington County, how did you intend to grow the operation? What were your goals early on, Mark?
Well, originally when we came back, I farmed with my dad and my brother, and it was diversified in those things. But I was interested in doing more no-till work for more low cost, and I wanted to push the cattle. I thought there was a lot more potential in that, and so I've been interested in purebred breeding of cattle. And so along the way, we put in embryos for Galen Fink since 1990. And so that was another project that I really enjoyed, just to see what strides can be made with genetics, and then to be able to compare the purebred calves to the crossbred calves and how they perform in the same environment. And I also really enjoyed the embryo, so they are full siblings, and see how that group responds and see how much variation there is in the group to see what progress that one could make with that. And so then in 2008, then Evelyn and I went off on our own and said these are some of the things that we want to pursue, and then we started doing those things. And in 2011, we had the opportunity to purchase some real high quality cows in Dalhart, Texas. And so we purchased those cows, and one thing after another happened, and we didn't come up with the grass that we wanted, and then the grass price took off, so you couldn't expand and afford to buy the grass. And so then we started this semi-confined cattle operation that we have today.
And that's been rather progressive. In fact, you've hosted a field day actually demonstrating your confined dry lot cow operation, right?
Yes, that is correct. So we just started trial and error and kind of pushing along. Well, let's try this. If that worked, well, can we make it a little better? Can we tweak it? And we didn't have any guidelines or anything, so we were just out there kind of creating our own barriers or fences, as you will, to grow the thing. And I'm not sure if we've reached the capacity of it, but I am sure that it is a cost-effective way that you can produce high-quality calves in a different environment without all the acres of grass.
It's been observed that you are awfully analytical about how you manage your genetics in general, but the cow herd overall. You don't stay still very long in terms of thinking about improvements, do you?
No, I look at it as, over time in agriculture, every 7 years the bottom 50% leave. And some of it's through retirement and some of it's through financial pressure. And so, just being average isn't good enough, And so agriculture in the past has been looked at as an industry, where we have chickens and milk cows and a red barn and, the pace is slow. But in reality, agriculture is a big business and it's got big teeth. And if you aren't going forward, pretty soon you're at the bottom. And so you need to be very cost effective. And then there's so many different scales. How do you fit in? You have the really big operators and the really small operators. And so how do you, where do you fit to be profitable? And that's key.
There are many facets of your operation that we could talk about. I do want to note that the two of you have hosted all sorts of field days over the years. The recent KLA field day featuring the confined cow operation, but you've had more groups in and you've tried to tell agriculture story that way, it sounds. Mm-hmm. Evelyn?
Let's see, the first field day he had was, I think that was in 2009.
Rotational grazing.
Yeah, and that was the rotational grazing, and he put a big pipeline in to
spring.
To develop the spring, the natural spring as a water source. And that was really kind of innovative at that time. There wasn't a lot of people doing that, and it worked out really nicely. The next one we did was it 2011? But it was putting in a tank underneath a pond dam.
Yeah.
You could explain more about that.
Yeah, it was. So we were looking at how to get tanks below ponds, and water was going down, and people were having trouble because the ponds being dry had receded. And so the cattle were going out in the mud trying to drink. And we said, how can we get that water in that tank without draining the pond, because the ponds are already dangerously low? And that's how that conversation got started. So I went to the extension people and said, this is a need we have. And so then there was a lot of people that were interested because they were in the same situation. So we said, well, let's just try it and put that on there.
It's important, though, that you've shared these ideas with others. You've been able to and have willingly wanted to pass along what you've learned in your own experiences, right?
Mm-hmm. Mark's really good about that. He enjoys visiting with people, and he likes asking other people's opinions.
That's exact. I like networking, and so I like to be able to share, because there's a lot of information and ideas out there that if you get people together that have a like interest, you can pick up something, from there.
Well, lastly, we'd like to have each of you express your thoughts as to what it means to be inducted as Master Farm family members. So we'll start with you, Evelyn.
Oh, I was extremely honored. It was a big surprise to open the envelope and be nominated, and so I just felt humbled and honored.
Mark?
I know several of the past recipients of it, and I've always respected those people. And to be included in that peer group is quite an honor. You wonder, did I really achieve that?
Mm-hmm. Deserve that.
Or did I really deserve that? With all the good operators that are out there. But it's a very nice honor.
Mark and Evelyn Diederich of Washington County, Kansas Master Farm Family, class of 2017. On tomorrow's broadcast, we'll tell you about two more of the couples in this class. Cliff and Kathy Heiniger of Brown County, and Doug and Jean Higbee of Franklin County. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today.
Did you know every Kansas farmer feeds 128-plus people?
Kansas farmers are hard workers, dependable, authentic, and sensitive.
Not only do farmers put food on your table, but they put clothes on your back and fuel in your car.
For more information about Kansas farmers, visit K-State Research and Extension online or stop by your local Extension office. This message has been brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
You're listening to Agriculture Today. Next up for you, this week's Wildlife segment with Charlie Lee, Wildlife Specialist, K-State Research and Extension. Charlie, a look today at the unintended consequences of ground squirrel control. These, to set the table here, can be a nuisance and then some to landowners.
This particular study looked at Colombian ground squirrels. You would put them fairly closely related to prairie dogs. Perhaps they're a little bit smaller, although the Colombian ground squirrels also spend a lot of time hibernating, probably only active about 100 days each year, but found in a small part of the U.S., in the Northwest, in the Rocky Mountains, and in the western part of Montana, where they're considered to be major pests in some crop fields. So recreational shooters go to that area to shoot Colombian ground squirrels at the invitation of many farmers and ranchers, and shoot lots of these small mammals each year. And scavengers then ingest those carcasses, and sometimes those scavengers can be poisoned when lead bullets are used.
That's the issue at hand here.
Yeah.
And let's identify what typically would be those scavengers. Most are in the raptor family?
Yes, these would be the raptors, hawks, owls. Also, crows would be involved, and it could be as well as it could be mammals. This study primarily referenced raptors, avian predators that are feeding on carcasses that are left or offal that is left behind. They also have the ability to catch and kill these animals as a predator, but this particular study showed that when those carcasses are available, the raptors would consume them.
And the intent here was to get an idea of how much shot, and lead shot in specific, was left over as a residual in those carcasses. And how did they approach this?
Well, it was a study that looked at 3 different locations. They used 3 different calibers of firearms, and then they collected carcasses. Those carcasses of Columbian ground squirrels were then radiographed or X-rayed to get an idea of distribution of lead fragments within those carcasses. Then some of those carcasses, a subset, was digested to determine the amount of lead that was contained within those carcasses. They also made a recording of whether the animal was instantly incapacitated at the time of shot or not. So that was kind of the study, and basically the premise was to look at different calibers, different types of ammunition, whether it was expanding or non-expanding, and then to compare that with a non-lead bullet.
So did they find that there are differences in the fragments left over depending on the ammunition here?
Yes, they found lots of differences, some things that were surprising to them. All types of the lead bullets left lead in at least 1/3 of the ground squirrels that were taken. Unexpectedly, they found concentrations of lead in carcasses did not differ between the expanding and the non-expanding bullets within the .17 HMR and the .22 long rifle calibers. They suspected that was because of the high variability in the fragmentation of those 2 bullet types. The amount of lead that were found within the ground squirrels was somewhat surprising to me, in that the .17 HMR and the .22 long rifles had a considerable amount of lead found per carcass. The .17 had 23 milligrams of lead. The .223 Remington had 91 milligrams of lead in those carcasses. That's not a very big number, but when you consider the amount of lead that may be necessary to cause mortality in a normal-sized raptor, something that would be about 2.2 pounds or a kilogram, that's only 5 milligrams of lead. To use the milligram as an example, it's not an exact comparison, but 5 milligrams of lead would be comparable in volume to about 5 granules of sugar.
So it doesn't take much for that lead to be lethal to a raptor.
No, the scavengers, when they feed on those, consume that amount of lead. That lead then can cause muscle weakness, lethargy, blindness, and death. And we've known that for a long period of time. That's been well studied in the hunting of migratory birds, including doves and waterfowl, and was one of the primary reasons many years ago that waterfowl hunting switched to requiring non-lead shot.
So is that what you just mentioned, the solution then, turning to a non-lead ammo to curb this issue?
Well, I'm not sure that that's going to be widely accepted because there are some problems with non-lead ammo, and one is that there's not very much information out there currently. There's not very many options for bullets that are non-lead. There are some copper bullets available. The problems with copper and other non-lead ammunition is that it's more expensive. In this particular report, they said the non-lead ammunition for the .223 Remington bullets was twice as expensive as the lead ammunition. However, that non-lead ammunition left no lead in the carcasses, so there's no need to recover contaminated carcasses, which is desirable for some hunters. It can be mitigated by simply picking up carcasses and disposing of those carcasses in below ground or taking them back to some other place for disposal where they're not left in the field subject to consumption by scavengers.
So that is basically the recommendation coming out of this study, to prevent the opportunity of raptors consuming these ground squirrels.
Yes, the important part here is to appreciate raptors, although their populations generally are increasing here in the United States. We don't want to be poisoning carcasses with recreational shooting, and we need to take steps to do what we can to mitigate the likelihood of that occurring.
Well, that's the upshot of a new study looking at firearm control of ground squirrels and the residual lead shot resulting from that control practice, which then can be damaging to raptors feeding on those ground squirrel remains. And Charlie, we appreciate the look at this work today. Wildlife Specialist, K-State Research and Extension, Charlie Lee. And with that, our Tuesday edition comes to a close. Thanks for being along with us. Eric Atkinson here. This has been Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.